Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into a biblical concept that is way more than just birth order, the firstborn. As we'll see, it's actually a title of profound spiritual responsibility and inheritance. So let's get into it.
Our whole journey today starts with a pretty tense confrontation in the Gospel of Matthew. You have Jesus making this stunning accusation against the most respected religious leaders of his time. It's a powerful moment that really forces us to ask, what on earth were they missing that made him call them blind? So to really get to the heart of that answer, here's our game plan. We'll start with the conflict itself, and then we're going to redefine this crucial term, firstborn, by looking at what their role was supposed to be. Then we'll see how that title was completely transformed, which reveals who the true spiritual heirs are today.
All right, first up, blind guides and empty words. We're jumping straight into that moment. Jesus called out the spiritual leadership, and it all comes down to this core conflict: their traditions versus God's actual commandments.
This quote right here, this is the heart of the whole issue. Jesus is accusing them of elevating their own human-made rules above the clear commandments of God. For instance, they'd created this kind of loophole so a person could declare their money a gift to God just to get out of financially supporting their aging parents, which, directly contradicts the command to honor your father and mother. In doing that, they basically canceled out the power of God's word, and it made their worship pretty meaningless.
And this is just so important. The core problem is that when the designated spiritual guides get it wrong, everybody suffers. Like Jesus warned, if the blind lead the blind, they both end up in a ditch. This perfectly sets the stage for our whole exploration today. Who was actually supposed to be leading?
And that leads to a huge question, right? If the established leaders were blind, then who was truly meant to be the guardian of God's truth? Well, the answer lies in this biblical concept of the firstborn.
Way before the Pharisees ever came along, this title wasn't even given to an individual. It was given to an entire nation. In the book of Exodus, God actually calls the nation of Israel his firstborn son. But this wasn't just a term of endearment. It signified a very specific role.
And this is where we kind of have to shift our thinking, away from the literal and into the spiritual. The advantage of being called firstborn wasn't about being the first nation on earth. Nope. It was about a unique responsibility they were given. So what exactly was that responsibility?
Well, fast forward a few centuries, and the Apostle Paul lays it out perfectly for us. When he's asked, hey, what's the big deal about being part of this chosen nation anyway? He states it plainly. First of all, they were entrusted with the very words of God. That was their inheritance, their great honor, to be the keepers of the divine message. So this becomes our new working definition. And here's the key insight, really. In the biblical sense, the firstborn is the one entrusted with God's word and given the authority to speak his truth. It's a role, not a birthright.
Okay, but here's the thing. Being entrusted with this truth, it's not some passive privilege where you can just sit back and relax. Nope, it comes with a heavy, life-or-death responsibility, which is powerfully illustrated in our third section, the watchman's solemn duty.
The prophet Ezekiel gives us this powerful image. Imagine a watchman on a city wall. His job is to see danger coming and warn the people. But what if he sees the threat and just stays silent? Well, the people might perish, and God holds that watchman accountable for their lives. The responsibility is just immense. This perfectly illustrates the active duty of the firstborn. It's not enough to just have God's word. The responsibility is to understand the spiritual dangers of the time and to sound the alarm. When you're entrusted with the truth, silence is simply not an option. Now, this whole idea, the firstborn as a responsible watchman, is absolutely crucial because it sets the stage for a dramatic turning point in history. And that's what we're getting into in section 4, a new kind of firstborn.
And bam, here is the pivot. John's gospel tells us that Jesus, the Word made flesh, came to the firstborn nation, the ones entrusted with God's words. But they did not receive him. And in that very moment of rejection, something incredible happened. A new path to this spiritual inheritance was opened up to anyone who would receive and believe.
This was a seismic shift. The definition of who belongs in God's family was radically redefined. It was no longer about your bloodline or your ancestry, but about belief, faith, and spiritual acceptance of the Word himself.
So what does this new spiritual family actually look like? Well, that brings us to our final section, the promise, not bloodline, where we discover who the true heirs of this firstborn inheritance are today.
And once again, the Apostle Paul makes it crystal clear. True spiritual heirship isn't about physical descent. It's about being a child of God's promise, being born into that inheritance through faith.
And what's so fascinating is that this isn't a new pattern. As you can see right here, the Bible shows this principle playing out again and again. Abraham's first son was Ishmael, but the child of promise was Isaac. Isaac's firstborn was Esau, but the inheritance went to Jacob. Time and time again, God's choice prioritizes the spiritual promise over the physical birth order.
And that right there is our ultimate takeaway. The inheritance of the firstborn, that huge responsibility and privilege of being entrusted with God's word, is now available to all who are born of the promise through faith. They become the new spiritual heirs, the new watchmen.
So we end by turning this back to all of us. If this spiritual inheritance now belongs to those who believe, and the duty of that inheritance is to be a watchman, it leaves us with a critical question. What is the danger on the horizon, and what is the warning we are meant to sound today?